So I've got Dr. Carlo Morelli with me. So Carlo, welcome
Hi, Abdullah.
to this chit chat session, our so-called podcast. So the plan is it's a more like informal, so nothing technical. It's mainly for like general public, so that everyone can understand what we are talking about. So like obviously the COVID pandemic created lots of stress in our life, in our system, international politics and all kind of things. So like lots of speculation, what's going to happen in future, like the post-COVID world order. So the so-called experts like us and the other experts are saying that, oh, there'll be more conflict, more competition. So that's one group. The other group is saying that no, the way things were, we are doing lots of things collectively, and then there'll be less competition. The world will be more humane, and we'll see like lots of progress from this, like learning from COVID-19. And the third group is saying that basically, the way things are, it's like post Second World order, this like Western neoliberal model, so which we have been seeing, especially from like post 90s with like Clinton and all those people came to power, and suddenly obviously with the Bush, the war on terror. So it's like more disturbing type of like liberal democracy. And then lastly, we saw like Trump in that equation as well. So we have got Biden in the new administration. So, but still lots of things need to be discussed. Lots of things are not clear, but I think as an economist, economist, historian, I think we can learn so many things from you. So, Carlo, these are the things we'll do a bit. So these are the bigger picture, but we'll start with like, just tell us about Carlo as a human being, where you were born, and tell us a bit of your, childhood memories, and like how this, the kind of any kind of politics you guys were talking during the dinner table as a family gathering. So that kind of, we really want to know some of those earlier memories about your political upbringing.
Okay. I don't get asked this very often, so I'm not sure what I should tell you. Okay, so I was born and brought up in London. I was born in '63, so I was really brought up in the 1970s, really. In a big family, 6 brothers and sisters together in total. Irish, Italian background. In part of northwest London. So I was born in Hackney. We moved when I was young to northwest London, which is area near Wembley, which is really the suburbs of London. And what was interesting there is, now sort of reflecting on it, at the time you don't notice it, it's just where you live. It was a very multiracial community. My next door neighbours were Jewish. The other neighbours were Irish. Neighbours after that were English. And it was a period when there was a lot of Asian migration into London in the 1970s. So I was at a school, primary school, secondary school, which was very multiracial. By the ending of my school years, from about 14, well, probably about 15, 16, that's when racial tensions were emerging in Britain in the late 1970s. A fascist organisation called the National Front was starting to emerge, particularly in London. And that was very formative in terms of my ideas and my upbringing. A lot of my friends were multiracial, others were English, but almost overnight, a whole group of my friends became National Front members, which I found really quite shocking, because they suddenly separate themselves off from everybody else, and took on all this kind of nonsense that fascists were doing. And this was also a time when punk as a music scene was emerging, so I was involved in that, which again was influenced by reggae and multiracial ideas. And so there was a real polarization in my communities, or my community and others, around the issue of race. And it involved a lot of conflict in school. And a lot of my friends as sort of young teenagers suddenly weren't by my mid-teenage years, and increasingly became polarized as the school became quite politicized. And I remember very early on, if you want an early memory, I remember there was a teacher's strike. I can't remember when this would have been. Must have been when I was about 13, 14. I didn't know nothing about strikes at the time. Just that there was a strike and there was a picket line of teachers on the school gate, and I was talking to them. And so I was asking them, can I not go into school today? And they were insisting that I cross the picket line to go to school, and I couldn't quite understand that. I thought this would be a good reason for not to go to school today. But alas, the picket line told me I had to go to school. That's what I remember about that. But anyway, so it was London was an interesting time to be around there, but it was very polarizing. It was polarizing around race and racism, and that was very formative in terms of my upbringing. Because of course I was Irish Italian background, so I was on the wrong side of the fence as far as these Nazis were concerned. So that was a good thing. So that was that really. And what else did you want to know? So okay, so I left school at 16. I was told by one of my teachers that if I didn't leave, I'd be thrown out. So that was just as well. I wasn't getting on well at school. I was doing okay, but I was quite, I was in one of the top classes, but I was bored by the time I was 15, 16. So I went to a further education college to do my A-levels, and that was much, much better. I much preferred that. And then after various little jobs, at some point, I decided to go to university. Well, I actually went to university. I took this. I thought I would go to university at some point, but not initially. But the decision was made for me because that's when they decided they were going to abolish grants and bring in fees. So I knew if I didn't go to university at that point in time, I wouldn't ever go to university. I wouldn't be able to afford it. So I packed in my job and went to university, Queen Mary, in East London, to do modern history. And I had a very, very good lecturer called Sarah Palmer, who was an economic historian. She was really, really good. So I had a couple of classes, and she directed me to sort of, back in those, I think you can still do it, I'm not sure, but the University of London is a conglomerate of different colleges and universities. And if you're in one, you can take courses in another quite easily. They used to have this huge big book of all the possible courses available, and you could basically pick and choose. It was a really good system. So anyway, I ended up doing courses at UCL. I ended up doing a course at LSE, and met various different lecturers who were interesting, all around social history, economic history, modern history. And long and short of that was, again, I came across a lecturer at LSE who was interested in economic history. And I started asking him about doing a PhD. And he told me about the ESRC funding and doing an application. And as a naive undergraduate, I put in this application for the ESRC funding for a PhD, which is really rare to get. Well, I got it. And I'm sure I didn't get it. I'm sure I got it because my supervisor's name was on the form. To this day, I'm pretty sure that was why I got funding for a PhD. Unbeknownst to me, I'd happened to pick one of the most influential professors in business history in the UK, if not globally, by accident. Anyway, so the choice of leaving university without a job or going to do teacher training came up, or taking 3 years of funding from the SRC. It was a bit of a no-brainer, really. So I went off to do a PhD, and it was only halfway through my PhD I discovered, unbeknown to me, this tells you about my background, really, how my naivety was. Yeah, I discovered you could get jobs in universities doing teaching and research. And I thought, oh, that's quite a nice idea. So that's when I decided, I thought I might as well try and see if I can become a university lecturer. I didn't realise how you do it. But since my funding was running out, I got a temporary contract at Warwick, again in economic history. My PhD was in economic history. And long and short of it, by a bit of a roundabout route, I ended up in Dundee. They offered me a job, and 20 plus years later, here I am. So that's kind of how I ended up in Dundee, really.
Like one side question here, like so the first side question is because these days when students apply for any kind of funding, they have to like fill up like hundreds of pages forms. I mean, how long was the form during those days?
Oh, I don't remember. It wasn't massive, but it was certainly on the way to becoming these long application processes. It's worse now, because if I remember then, you just had to have an idea of what you were going to do and what you were going to look at and how you were going to do it. Now you're expected to have the results and show the impact it's going to have on society in advance, which you think, well, which is a stupid thing to do. I mean, if you knew that, you wouldn't be doing the research, you'd be just doing the impact.
At what point you decided that economic history is your life, is your career? What's that moment? I mean, when that moment?
Well, I came into history after school, after education, because my background is maths, physics, chemistry, and the sciences. That's what I did at school and at A-levels. But after leaving school, I was involved, like I said, I was involved in anti-racism. I was interested in music and politics, started to come into it. And that's how I started to get interested in social history and social questions. But in particular, I got interested in economics, and not formal economics, but economic history, and understanding how economics could actually explain the world. But it's not in the way in which it's taught at universities, a traditional economics degree. It was much more political economy, really. So it was interdisciplinary, much interested in political history, social history, political economy, those kind of ideas. And there were and are vibrant debates in the socialist movement, which teaches people how, because actually it wasn't just simply knowing what the words are and how to read them. It was actually how to understand political argument and understand social questions and social history. And I think the working class movement has always done that, from right back from the tradition of working class libraries in mining areas and literacy for workers, from the workers' education associations. The working class movement has always had a deep interest in intellectual thought and intellectual ideas, much more seriously than a lot of universities do. And I was part of that, and that's was where my interest really developed from. And so when it came to university, I could have done a traditional history degree, or I could have done a modern history degree, and I chose modern history. And in the process, that's when I ended up floating around different colleges in the University of London and came across these economic historians and social historians. And that's what sort of sparked my interest in this. And a lot of them were doing 19th, early 20th century social and economic history. The Industrial Revolution, the move to urbanization, the development of capitalism in Britain, the sort of 17th, 18th century. I was much more interested in the later period, so the 20th century. So that's why I was interested in doing a PhD in post-Second World War economic history.
Well, one of the interesting things, I mean, when I was doing my PhD with my supervisor, so I mean, obviously he played a big role in my, life choices, career, and everything. But also, he's the person who actually inspired me, like to do this, do that, and I kind of went with his ideas, And basically, whenever I do things, I still remember him as a kind of, like role model, um, kind of person, the kindest person I've ever seen, and also very human, and also like, involved in lots of social thing as well personally. It's not only he was teaching, he was political activist. He was doing lots of good things for the society. Even one of his idea about, because he was involved in peacekeeping in his teaching and research, and he ended up, when he retired, the first thing he did, he went to a place called East Timor, which is just got independence, and he was there as one of those earliest experts to rebuild that country. So that's an amazing story. So like, instead of having retirement, like going to France to have some good summer, he actually went to East Timor, whereas there's nothing there. I spent 6 months.
I did the opposite. I mean, you often reinterpret your history or history generally with a different perspective from at the time. But my memory at the time was actually I chose this PhD supervisor not because I liked him, but because I knew he was, I did understand that he was an important figure in this field, and that's why I approached him to do a PhD. But I approached him because I disagreed with him. He's a complete neoliberal, and is and was, and the subject here is largely dominated by neoliberal ideas. But that was part of my interest. It wasn't to replicate socialist history or socialist interpretations of history. It was to challenge the right-wing interpretation and dominance of economic history. So I deliberately chose someone I would disagree with because I wanted to understand their ideas. I wanted to understand how they interpreted the world and how they use theory to interpret the world. Because often in political debates over neoliberalism, it's suggested neoliberal ideologues have no ideas, no theory. They're just obsessed with markets. Well, that's not true. They do have an understanding of theory. It's wrong. I disagree with it. But actually, we have to treat their ideas seriously. And that's really what framed my PhD, really very early on. I understood what I was doing, that I wanted to take their interpretation of the world and follow it and see how far it's matched with the reality. And of course it doesn't. So, and that's something I think if you're going to be a socialist, if you're going to be an academic, you have to understand their ideas, the ideas you disagree with, better than those people who advocate those ideas. That's what I did. One of the funny things about my history in terms of as an academic is people would hear things I was saying, and they'd be hearing papers or they'd read a paper I'd written. And it is because I'm using the framework of neoliberalism, they would assume this is a neoliberal paper and this is a neoliberal talk. And then I'd get invited to some really strange places. I got recently invited to an Institute of Economic Ideas seminar just the other week. I thought, and I would often go to these things. And I'd have a debate with them and say, this is what you think, but that's the conclusion of what you think, which is clearly wrong. And they wouldn't invite me back. They'd realise that there was something not quite right here. But it's because you could articulate their ideas better than they could. And I think you have to do that as an academic. If you're going to challenge someone's ideas, you have to understand them better than they do.
But also, do you think that's like kind of Marxist interpretation about, how the history progresses in terms of, this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis?
Yeah.
You have to fight that, you have to create that clash situation.
Yes.
And from that clash situation, you can get a better version of knowledge than the knowledge.
Yes. And it's because those who reject the idea of dialectics accept incrementalism, evolutionary ideas, and the concept of just Whiggish history of the great white men version of history. And there is no conflict there. there's just progress. And therefore they cannot understand why societies collapse as well as progress, and why you can get polarization, why you can get inequalities. Those are just byproducts of an unfortunate byproduct of human progress. That's really their conclusion to that. So yeah, I think a Marxist, and there's lots of types of Marxism, so it's a bit of a broad statement to make, but broadly speaking, I think an interpretation of history that looks at discontinuity, looks at dialectic ideas, is much better at explaining historical processes than this sort of evolutionary incremental Whittish type of approaches.
Try to get closer to our, the topic area. Because my pandemic is like, it's a kind of, for me, it's like, black swan, came from nowhere. So like pandemic's never been part and parcel of my research or any kind of interest. But then I started reading some of those things the earlier, especially the early like 20th centuries, when like I think 1918 isn't it the big pandemic.
Spanish flu, yeah.
The Spanish flu, and then that cost like almost 55 million people's lives. I mean, that's like huge like event. But I mean, one of the things I found that in terms of the political history or economic history, that the Spanish flu is like, I don't know, like it's not that much discussed or like explored, and the people are more interested in like the Wall Street crash or like the First World War and withdrawals on the League of Nations, is 14 points. So like those things were like more in the mainstream, but it looks like world just moved on, and then people blamed for the Second World War Wall Street crash rather than actually the 55 million people lost their lives, and then how it actually what will be take on the Spanish flu. Did it put any kind of like any kind of impact in our understanding about politics in that early 20th centuries, like world order?
Yes, I think it did, and I think I'm not an expert on pre Second World War economic history, but the Spanish flu was part of the dislocation of the world economy that had emerged by 1914, and what I mean by that is the emergence of imperialism, the emergence of states and capital coming together in a militaristic conflict reached its zenith in 1914. And that's because now we had a series of industrialized economies which are now conflicting over the dominance of the global economy and raw materials and colonialism and empire. That was central to the drive towards the First World War and its relevance to today and the COVID pandemic. I'll come to that later. And so the Spanish flu was part of that collapse. Yes, there was a military conflict. Yes, there was destruction in terms of a military war for 1917, 1918. But actually the consequences of that meant that when an illness emerged, the population, the economies were in a far weaker position to be able to deal with that. And so it's the impoverishment of the population after years of slaughter that led to the fact that a flu virus can have far more devastating effects than it would in other times. So it shouldn't be a surprise that on the back of a major conflict that a particular virus or a particular natural illness emerges that has a much greater effect than it would have done in other times. And the consequence of that, of course, was, like you said, 54 million people dying on top of the deaths of the First World War. It has a massive impact on the economies and their recovery and the slump that happens in the 1920s. because immediately after the First World War, there was a massive boom until 1921, as all the profits from the war by factory owners, capitalism or capitalists in the system were reinvested, and of course that pretty quickly ran into a slump as overinvestment and a lack of profitability in the global economy re-emerged, and that's what then foreshadowed the 1920s and 1930s in terms of the political polarization. Hobsbawm uses a lovely phrase. I think he says the period from 1914 to 1945, so the First World War and the Second World War, was really one period. The Second World War solved the problems that the First World War failed to solve. And so that period of 2 world wars and a massive economic slump need to be understood as a single entity. One had their origins in the other.
Normally, the war, peace, and then war, this like cycle normally comes like 100 year. So if you look at the before First World War, we saw like this Napoleonic War when the system collapsed during that time, or before Napoleonic War we saw like this like Treaty of Westphalia after like 40 years war. So every that kind of serious collapse more or less comes another 100 year. But with like First World War and Second World War, there's not much window there. It's just within 25 years, 20 years, just come up. So basically, I think the First World War was still dealing with that, the collapse of the system, because the collapse was so heavy. It's almost like 4 or 5 empires just gone from the world politics. So like lots of things need to be restructured, redistributed, and so all kind of things. And then we ended up with like the world order, which the people who were like the leaders during that time. So obviously in terms of Germany, I think it's like, that's the start of the more like new kind of politics, like by 1930s, it's like rise of Nazi Germany. But if you look at the American politics, after Woodrow Wilson, the next 3 terms will be like actually, controlled by the Republican Party. And like one of the guy during that time came as actually, and one of my favorite like person, I always quote him. So it's the Andrew Mellon, who's the Treasury Secretary for all 3 terms. This is so powerful. No one actually got rid of him. And even like 1929, the Wall Street crash, one of his like famous quote is like, the crisis is always good because in a crisis, the assets always come back to its original owner, i.e. him, who's a banker. So like lots of incompetency in terms of world leadership. Sometimes I feel that the world we have been like last like 4 or 5 years, especially like from the like Bush Jr., then obviously Russia has got like Putin for some time, and then like 2015 onwards, there's a serious rise of this like this nationalist all kind of bad politics on the ground. So that's why I'm kind of worried that like whether it has got like much more serious consequences from these outcomes, because we seriously damaged the world. Obviously 2008, this economic crisis is a kind of mini collapse of the system, and then there's no leadership, and then we ended up with like Trump at one point, and then we have got this pandemic. People like me, like who are doing politics or international relations, we are like more cautious about the positive future of the world at the moment. It'll be interesting like to hear from you, like as an economist, and your understanding about this like current world order a bit.
I think since the great crash of 2008, and then even more so the COVID crisis, has done one thing that has refuted one of the dominant themes of politics and political economy since the 1990s. And that is the idea that you can separate the state from the economy, and that the business in the economy doesn't need the state. This, Francis Fukuyama's argument, the end of history, that markets will predominate, and the rolling back of the state is the key driver of economic development. That's been shown to be completely bankrupt. It's, you just have to look at the development of COVID vaccines. You just have to look at the way in which the state has had to step in, both in 2008 and also in 2020, in order to prop up the system. Without the state, there would be no capitalism. And all the rhetoric about big business, multinational business being footloose and fancy-free is nonsense. They're highly dependent upon their own national state, no matter how internationalized they are. They're highly dependent upon their nation state to defend their profitability. And I think and why I would say that is that's got a direct parallel back to 1914. The First World War didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a series of conflicts where states and capital had come together in the creation and reconstruction of different market environments. And so the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the race for the grab for Africa from the 1870s onwards, was all about state and capital coming together to monopolize markets for one nation state and national capitals rather than another. And that we can see in the vaccine discussion. All this discussion about vaccine nationalism is really a discussion about the way in which the state and capital again comes together. And the construction of states and capital is essential for, and the way in which they emerge is essential for the development, the history of COVID. And so I think that's part and parcel of this discussion that's emerging now, is the state plays a huge role in the development of capitalism and continues to, and that's also because private capitalism cannot survive and cannot develop in some form of stability without the backing of the state underpinning it and protecting it. And that's what we're seeing. So, if you look at the vaccine production, it's dominated by a small number of large pharmaceutical companies who are doing this because they know there's a huge market for this thing called a vaccine. And it's not an accident. I was just looking at the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, before this talking to you. They've got an article from January which talks about the differential prices between these different vaccines, and it's quite astonishing. So you'll have seen some of the critiques of the AstraZeneca vaccine, without any reference to whether or not these same critiques apply to the other vaccines. But this was an item raised in Radio 4, the 7 o'clock news program. So again, it's not a particularly left-wing news program. They were asking the question: is the critique of the AstraZeneca vaccine a product of the fact that it's so cheap relative to the private vaccines that are emerging? Because the difference is between around $2 to $3 a dose, up to about $18 a dose. And so AstraZeneca is saying they'll produce for cost price at $2 to $3 or $4 a dose, compared with the other vaccines, which are between $8, $10, and up to $18 a dose. You think, no wonder some of these big pharmaceutical companies and their states that back them are none too happy that a firm has come in that's producing the same thing at a much, much lower price. So states and capital are inextricably linked here, and being able to separate them off is very, very difficult. It's impossible to do in 21st century capitalism. And we can see that more widely. The post-COVID world is a world which has accelerated the trends since 2008 at least, and that is of rival capitals and their nation states beginning to try to reorder the world and coming into conflict with one another, and therefore beginning to fashion the world under the sort of guise of imperialism that's emerging just as it did before the First World War. If you look at the history of the Balkans before 1914, if you look at the history of the conflicts that emerged in Africa around the different colonial powers, well, we're seeing not dissimilar things in the Middle East today. We're seeing not dissimilar things in Ukraine, in the breakup of Yugoslavia. You're seeing the imperialist interests playing a big role here. And so too with the COVID vaccine. Now, the news today was apparently the American government are pretty upset, and that the European governments might be looking at Russia to supply them with the Sputnik vaccine. And you think, why would anyone worry about this? Except they're not worried about the vaccine, they're worried about the political consequence of the European Union and Russia coming closer together from a political perspective. So political economy, the connection between state and capital is even more important now than it was 20 years ago. And is central to explaining some of the things that are going on in the world today.
Like, I mean, one of the things I found from the current politics, it looks like obviously countries like China, India, Russia are also trying to, be part of this like new world order. So they're also trying to, mold this future world from their own interpretation of the history. And there, it looks like, China and Russia are doing lots of things, like in terms of, sending those like vaccines to the third world country in the global south, big way. So like, so that's quite interesting. Things we saw, especially after the Second World War. So the world is all about, it's like American-led world order or America's kind of world. Suddenly we are seeing something else is also going, some kind of this normative, the ideas are coming from like the other part of the world as well. So that's quite interesting development, especially with this pandemic. It created some kind of vacuum there in terms of leadership, and China, especially China, is coming with like full force here.
But that's not a surprise, is it? I mean, the world, the global world order that emerged after 1945, it was a world ordering of the Western economies. Bear in mind that the Russia and its influence in the Eastern economies meant that you had these two superpowers, both imperialist powers, who were influencing their spheres of influence in competition with one another. So the globalization that began to emerge by the late 20th century wasn't a globalization for everyone. It was a subordination of large parts of the world for the interests of other parts of the world. And I don't mean the peoples, I mean it's the nation states and capitalism and capitalists who benefited from this. So there was, by the 1960s, 70s, it was widely recognized there was underdevelopment, structural inequalities and structural underdevelopment in the what was then called the Third World. And that was built into the relationships that were created from the 1940s onwards. And decolonization, the end of empire, all led to the development in different parts of the world of their own economic development, and pretty quickly running up against the barriers of the structure of the world economy that was then emerged, that had then been created in the West's influence, in the Western sphere, by Britain and America and the European powers. So the inability of large parts of the world, like Sub-Saharan Africa most notably, to integrate, to develop into as a partner in that process was impossible. They were subordinated. They were junior partners at best. And not surprisingly, therefore, when opportunities emerge, when new imperialist powers emerge and new imperial interests emerge, it's not a surprise that those new imperial powers like China are beginning to court and seek to develop those underdeveloped parts of the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. So they're using why are we surprised that they're using vaccines as soft power, just as the West uses other kinds of aid as soft power? That's what's happening here. There's imperialist interests, and it needs to be understood in a multipolar imperialist world. There's still dominant imperialist powers, but below that there are minor and regional imperialist powers that nevertheless have the backing of major imperialist powers. Look at Myanmar at the moment. You know, the generals are able to get away with what they're doing and killing the population precisely because they've got the backing of Russia or China or both of them. And the Western powers equally turn a blind eye to the killings in their own spheres of influence, like in the Middle East. So this is a world of imperialist powers, and there's sub-imperialist powers in the linked to them, which unsurprisingly create huge social conflict within these different states.
That's quite interesting, because it looks like because obviously the world we saw, especially in the late 90s onward, is the post-Cold War world order. Is suddenly the idea about this liberal democracy, and then idea about the interdependency, but also there's an undertone there that this liberal democracy would be from America's term, not like other countries' terms.
Exactly.
But it looks like with this China's this idea about their kind of world order is kind of creeping, isn't it? Kind of emerging with this pandemic, especially if you look at even this economic crash in 2008. It looked like China has been doing well in terms of economy, even like last year's in terms of economic growth. I mean, China is still in a positive plus side of the economic growth, where the rest of the world just nowhere near. So obviously these things can come in as this, if the world is moving beyond this pandemic. What we'll see, is it more strong competition? The flip side of the script can be so all will work together, the Western world, Western hemisphere, and China will cooperate with each other, because they have been doing lots of business in terms of the business ideas. There are lots of cooperation there, but at the same time, those cooperations are mainly kind of state level, but also the big business level, not with the common people, the people on the ground. So they are not getting those benefits the way the big companies like Google or Apple or the car industry or the fossil fuel industry are making money.
There's a contradiction. I mean, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about dialectics. There is both a contradiction and a unity in the development of the global economy and the relationship between states and capital. Private capital seeks to generate profit irrespective of where it comes from. And in that sense, it is ambiguous or ignores state relations and state boundaries. But actually, its ability to make profit is dependent upon those state boundaries and state influence. I mean, it's the phrase, there've been no McDonald's without McDonnell Douglas. There's some truth here. So big business in multinational business are only too happy to make use of the Chinese economy and cheap labor to produce manufactured goods by outsourcing and globalizing production systems. Yet at the same time, they also need their own state and the Western states to maintain their position of dominance in the global market. And the reason why is that rival states and rival big businesses will emerge in this process that will outcompete them. So if you look at Huawei versus Apple in the smartphone industry, here's a company that didn't exist a few years ago. It doesn't go through the stages of production in some linear fashion. It starts off not existing, and then becomes a high technology smartphone manufacturer immediately overnight. So it doesn't go through all the stages that Apple and Microsoft and all the other companies. They learn the new technologies and adapt these new technologies immediately, and very quickly they go beyond the existing technologies. So they become a leader in technology, not a follower. That's a tradition. That's always been the case within industrial capitalism. And it's always been the case that big business will try and continue to make profits, even though it may be at odds with the political dialogue coming out of their states. But when it comes, but their ability to do so is dependent upon the backing of their state and the ability of the state to protect them. So to give you an example from the First World War, the typical history of the First World War is it fractured economic integration of the global economy and pushed economies into national autarky. And the problems of the 1920s is rebuilding a global economy. That's not true. During the First World War, British companies continued to trade with Germany. And during the First World War, German companies continued to trade with Britain. They were using South America as the route into the different economies. So the trade of big business was still going on during the war, and continued, but it couldn't be direct. There were indirect means by which trade could take place, and South America was typically the route used by companies to import and export in the midst of a global war or war across Europe. So that these contradictions always exist, but the ability of these firms to continue to do that, to continue to make profits, is predicated on the existence of their state to protect them and to maintain their position in their national and global markets. Just as China and the US might come into political conflict, but all of these companies want to carry on trading as much as possible and avoid some of the conflicts, the economic conflicts that might emerge. And if you look at the dominant political power, the US, trying to prevent China emerging as a dominant economic power, what does it do? It doesn't just limit Chinese imports into America or the economic relationship between America and China. It also then tries to influence the Chinese relationship with Europe and the Chinese relationship with other economies by trying to ban them working from, on the 5G network, for example, and trying to push them out of markets. That again has always been the case.
Like closing to our discussion.
Sorry.
Lots of things we should have covered, but I mean, we can come back to some of those points we are not dealing with today. So like 50 years timeline, if you're talking about from today, where we are heading for.
If COVID has taught us anything, it's taught us actually states can override the market and force economic decision making into a different direction. It can override the market environment to protect living standards, jobs, health services, creating vaccines, or whatever you want to think of. If it can do that in a pandemic, why can't it do that over climate change? But it does mean over. Now, we haven't got into the contracts around COVID that went to private companies and the kind of corruption embedded within that. But it shows what can be done if states choose to. But they won't choose to; they're forced to. The Western powers didn't give a damn about COVID when it was in China and Wuhan, just as they didn't give a damn about Ebola when it was restricted to parts of Africa. It was only when it started to actually become a global problem that suddenly they woke up to realize, they better do something about this. So states won't, Western powers, the dominant states in the world, aren't going to unilaterally decide this. They're going to be forced into to make changes. And that's where social movements come in. That's where social change comes from. Comes back to our question: do economies develop incrementally, evolutionary, linearly, or is there conflict? Is there a dialectic here, a synthesis?
It's a kind of crossroad for our humanity, isn't it? So we have got this climate change situation. If you don't do it like very quickly, then half of the world's population will be gone. And the second thing is like this pandemic. We still don't know how this will turn up in like next 1 or 2 years time. And then back of that, in 2008 economic crash, which we still did not recover from. So like these three things just in front of us, it's like a situation like we have to make a choice now, whether the way we dealt with this thing, that how state can actually take care of their citizens in a like serious situation like pandemic. So with this like 3-4 serious situation where the globe will be united and says that what, we will do something about that, because this like tragedy of the commons suddenly just in front of us, and it's a kind of we just cannot delay it. So the time is ticking. We've got to do something about that. It's like next 30 years, got to do something about that. So it's a like two like this like thesis antithesis is there, and it's like one will win, or if this like clash goes on, then something new will come out, totally like new world order, which we never envisioned right now. It's like more philosophical question.
I was going to say that's a good point to end, even for everybody else to work that one out.
So just like last like 2 minutes, like for the students, what advice will you give about their study, or about like, I mean, how they can be like good citizens, who can defend this world for everyone, not for for like a big company or
Oh, I think it's too late in the evening for a profound comment from me. Leave them to work that one out themselves.
Okay. Thank you, Carlo, for your
Okay, that's right. I hope that's useful.
Bye, darling. Bye.
See you later.